Gustav, this is an incredibly challenging show for me to do with like a serious face because I know you socially. I think the world of you socially. And so now I get to put on a professional face and welcome you to 20VC. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. And likewise.
That is very kind. I've also been stalking the shit out of you for the last few days professionally. And so this has been great fun. But I want to start with a little bit on you, Gustav. So tell me, how did you make your way into the world of startups and then come to lead the product org at, one of the generational defining companies of our time with Spotify?
So I'll try to do the brief version of the history of my life. Could be a few hours here, but I'll try to do it in a few minutes.
You've got 3 to 4 minutes, so just take your time.
And then we cut. So I'm sort of actually this involuntary entrepreneur. I graduated from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, sort of electrical engineering, computer science. And then that was the tail end of the IT crash. So there were literally no jobs to be had. And so I found a group of friends. I wanted to work at one of these big, boring Swedish companies like Ericsson or something. But I couldn't get a job. So I decided with a bunch of friends to start a company. Because all these investments had been made during the IT era in, 3G and smartphones and so forth. It was all there, but no one believed in it. So we started this company where you could send text messages over data instead of SMS. And already back then, even though you paid per kilobit, it was still 1/1000 the cost of sending the same, 160 characters over text message. And it turns out that people love cheap communication. So that took off in a little bit in Sweden and in the Nordics. The problem was that the carriers back then controlled the world. And they were selling SMS bundles. They didn't like that. So we ended up selling this company to Yahoo. And because they had the biggest messenger application in the world, but it was desktop only. And they wanted to go big in mobile because mobile was starting to happen here. And they had all these relationships with the global carriers. So I ended up working at Yahoo in Sunnyvale for a bit. And I can tell you it was a troubled company already back then. So fast forward about 2.5, 3 years later, and I think 4 or 5 CEOs later, I was back in Stockholm trying to figure out what to do. And through a mutual friend, I met Daniel Ek, the founder and CEO, the co-founder and CEO of Spotify. And he showed me this amazing application because Spotify already existed as an application on desktop. And it was simply amazing. But what he wanted someone to head up what Spotify Mobile was going to be. Because this was 2008 and the iPhone had just come out, but there was no app store yet. And it didn't really have any market share. So the world was mostly Symbian, Sony Ericsson, these things. And so I happened to be, I got lucky. I had a moment in time where I knew something, how to develop for lots of different mobile phones that many other people didn't know. So that's how I came into Spotify, starting to head up product development for mobile.
Now, since then... Can I interrupt you there? Because there's just 2 things I want to pick up on first. Number one is Shaq actually told me about your entrepreneurial early days. And one thing I've very much seen in the best product leaders is really kind of the founder mindset and that accountability and ownership mindset that they bring to product. How do you think being a previous founder makes you a better product owner and product leader?
Well, I do think it is the ownership aspect. I can't help but think as a CEO, even when I'm at Spotify, which can be annoying for the CEO, for my peers, because you think about everyone else's shit as well. But I think it's important to have a holistic perspective. I kind of have to believe in the whole thing. Mm-hmm. If I don't feel I understand why Spotify should succeed, I can't help myself but asking, why are we doing it this way? So I kind of have that mindset. And I think it's more helpful than not, but I can't really help it.
The other question I have is, I've known Daniel for the last few years, but Daniel 2008, can you just take me back? What was it about Daniel and Spotify that convinced you that this was going to be, what was now a 14-year journey that you were going to commit to? What specifically was it?
It was 2 factors. It was the people, Daniel and many of the engineers who worked at Spotify and had built this amazing product. It really was the product. When I tried it, like everyone else, I just couldn't believe that it was true. I thought it was a fake. I thought they had a file server standing somewhere nearby because it was too fast. So it's obviously the product.
Shaq was running in the background with CD-ROMs.
Exactly. And then it was the people and Daniel. It was a very technology-centric and sort of meritocratic idea-based culture. It was like fierce debating, and the best idea won out. And I really like that. So those were two of the factors. And Daniel was very humble. I said was. He actually still is a very humble person. He claims himself that he's an introvert, even though I think he's actually very skilled these days. But just a very mellow person, kind of personality I really like. You know, non-hierarchical. You can debate intensely with him. So those were some of the factors. The other factor was simply naivety. You know how they say that being, ignorance is bliss. I had no idea about the music industry. If someone had told me, there's no chance I would have started. Statistically, it would have made no sense to join a music startup. But luckily for me, I had no idea, so I joined anyway.
You're clearly not a VC because there's no such thing as naivety. It's just insight and wisdom that made you choose Spotify, the right company.
All right. I forgot to phrase it the correct way.
I want to split the show today into two kind of separate parts. One is, you have this incredible podcast series, and there's a couple of core themes there that I love and I want to unpack. And then the second is really unpacking lessons from the Spotify journey. If we start with your amazing podcast series, which I love, I actually listen to it on my runs, which is, I wish it was shorter because I'm getting less and less fit. But my question to you is, you say in it, never fight a macro wind, you will lose. Can I ask, what did you mean by this? And can you explain that to me?
Sure. So macro winds are these big societal changes that are sort of bigger than any one individual or any one company. And even though I think everyone understands that you can't stop one of these changes. So what is a macro wind? Typical macro wind would be, cheap broadband. Mm-hmm. It's happening. You're not going to stop it. It's going to disrupt things. You should just accept it. Another one was smartphones, machine learning. It's another such macro win. These things happen. And I still see a lot of companies and product people who try to fight these things as if you can stop them. And this has been true for us as well. We've lived through some of these. I've literally had to learn this lesson. And what you should do instead of fighting is obviously to rethink your position, try to reposition yourself so that instead of having this wind blow in your face and slowing you down, you somehow get it at your back. And, I've been fortunate enough to be through a few of these. They're kind of scary. But the lesson is that the sooner or the quicker you accept it and reposition, the better. You're just not going to stop these things.
Can I ask, can you give me an example of a macro win that you went in the face of and then pivoted and decided that it was better to have it behind your back, just so I get a feeling for it?
Of course. An example for us, there are two good examples. One is when I joined Spotify, we had what was then a very profitable business model, which was you give the application away for free on desktop computers because people didn't think they wanted to pay for music. So then they started investing in music, playlisting and building libraries. And then they realized they actually wanted to listen to those playlists on the go, on their mobile phones. So we charge for the mobile application. So simply put, we charge for mobility. And that worked beautifully for several years. And, we loved it. VCs loved it. They invested a lot of money. But then all of a sudden, it turned out that this macro wind was blowing called smartphones. And we started seeing people that not only use their mobile phones more than their desktop and were mobile first, but many users that were mobile only. There was no desktop. So we didn't have a free tier at all for these users. So our business model broke. Now, we were not incentivized to want to see that in the short term. And we could see our user growth actually starting to slow down. But when we accepted this and we took the pain and the risk of repositioning all of Spotify, figuring out a way to give away the mobile experience for free, even though that was what we were charging for. So we literally changed the entire business model. We instead got this wind at our back and we started growing exponentially, literally exponentially, actually. And so it was a very clear example. If you look at the growth curve, you can see the macro wind blowing in our faces. Then you can see when we figure it out and we got it at our backs.
Can I ask, how did you take me inside the room there? How did you get over the fear of the cannibalization of an existing business model that was also working? You make it free. You could have a lot of the premium users, churn and just be ad-supported users, but free. And actually, you saw the cannibalization of existing user bases. How did you get over that concern? And what did the internal discussions look like there?
So we actually used a lot of data. It was Mary Meeker. I know precisely when we realized this. It was a deck from Mary Meeker that showed the projections of smartphone growth overtaking desktop growth. And we looked at that and we said, holy crap. You know, in 2012, it was almost like a date. This is going to blow up. So we discussed that a lot. We kind of found the confidence ourselves to do this. But the big problem we had was actually that we have other stakeholders in the labels. And the labels didn't see it. They were not looking at Mary Meeker's slides. And they were not so keen to risk the entire business model that they had just figured out after, you know, the whole, piracy era and so forth. So that was actually the bigger problem. And we had to wait all up until we had stopped growing and actually started losing users before they agreed to give us the licenses we wanted. But by then, we had prototyped and researched and A/B tested a bunch of different concepts. So when we got the licenses, we actually knew what we wanted to do and had already built the experience. And we launched it almost overnight when we signed the contracts.
I do just want to ask one final one before we move on to the next lesson, which is, how do you know whether it's a sustainable fundamental shift that you're fighting against or a unsustainable one? Point being that a lot of like consumer behaviors were changed in COVID that have now come back, and actually we've gone back to original behavior patterns. How much data do you need to know whether something is ongoing and continuous versus actually time-bounded and temporary? It's
a great question. And I think COVID is the perfect example because you knew, or you couldn't be certain, but you're quite certain that this would actually end. The question was this a fundamental shift in behavior or a temporary shift? And we had exactly this discussion when COVID started. It was much easier with something like the shift to mobile. Yeah. There was no real model where you saw people going back to desktop computers. Another such macro shift is, you know, from curation to recommendation, or as Mike Mignano puts it, from social media to recommendation media. That's not going to reverse. So those are quite easy. But COVID was hard. So we literally had the discussion, should we model this as a temporary anomaly, keep investing, for example, in the car, even though we saw car usage dip completely during COVID? Or should we just say no one is ever going to drive again? Let's reposition for the home use case. We chose the former. We said that we're going to model this as an anomaly. And we kept investing in the world going back to normal. And I can tell you that that was incredibly painful because we thought it would be over in 6 months, then in 12 months, and like 18 months later, it didn't look like it was going to go back. It's actually only now, in the last few months, that we clearly see it going back to the normal behaviors, you know, home usage going down, car usage and mobile usage going up. So it's hard, but we had that discussion. In general, we try to model the world and, you know, make predictions about how the world is going to work. I love models, basically. It's, you know, it's a structured way of thinking that gives you both predictability, explainability, but also shareability. If you explain your models, then others can use the same model and you can sort of distribute the way you think about the world.
What I love doing about these shows is the flexibility I have with the schedules. I'm with you. I love models too, but I'm also aware that, you know, you can't predict markets, and sometimes your model is wrong. And don't try and be smarter than the market. I guess my question to you is, like, how do you know when your model is wrong and you actually just need to change? 12 months into your investing in the, hey, post-COVID, we will go back to normal. Should you wait 6 months more? I mean, especially as a public company, it's even tougher. How do you know when your model is broken, and how do you know when to change?
Yeah, very tricky question. So first of all, regarding models, there is this famous saying that by definition, all models are wrong. That's why they're called models. If they weren't wrong, they're actually reality. But the whole point with the model is it simplifies reality because reality is too complex. So they are wrong. And one trick, so you're always taking a risk, you know, in sort of data machine learning terms, you're doing dimensionality reduction. Reality has infinite dimensions and you're reducing it to maybe 5. And if you pick the wrong dimensions, you know, you didn't model the spread of a disease, it's going to be wrong, right? Because that was not a dimension you had, and the real world is multidimensional. So that's the risk. One way to try to avoid it, that, you know, comes from sort of Berkshire Hathaway and how they think about the world is you should use at least 3 models with different dimensions. If they all agree, chances that you're completely wrong are much lower. But using one model, and I've done this mistake early in my career, you think you figure out how something works. You're like, that's how it works. And then you just do the same thing again and again. And you're using a single model and you're mistaking the world for being simple. It's just that you manage the model like a small moment in time and then it breaks completely. So I've gotten better at using multiple models, but there's no way to catch all of it. So I don't think many people's models predicted COVID happening.
I'm totally with you. I think if you did, you are now retired in Ibiza. My question to you is, and I'm sorry again for going completely off schedule, but I was chatting to Mignano about this, and he said, I don't know, speak to Gustav, and I probably should. And remember, this is said from a place of love. One of my favorite features in Spotify is the go to radio. It is also buried like 3 clicks in, and I didn't know about it until someone told me about it on Twitter. And when I think about the shift from curation to recommendation being so central to the future of content discovery and content platforms, why is it so buried? And is that a product mistake? I would love to say that's someone else's question, but it's mine, so forgive me.
It's a perfect question for me. So one answer is stay tuned. You will be happy. Another more telling answer is the way to think about it. We made choices between what the main paradigm is. The main paradigm of Spotify was playlisting. That's what Spotify was and what we grew up around, user curation. And then, we started playlisting for you, and we had to decide, should we have the radio channel as the analogy or should we have the personalized playlist as the analogy? And they kind of do the same job. A personalized playlist within a certain genre like chill, it is very similar to starting a chill radio. Literally, you will get the same songs, actually. So we've struggled a little bit with which user paradigm to use. And as you can imagine, older people, they like radio paradigms, and younger people, maybe not so much. I'm not calling you old here, Harry, but
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm wearing a Panama hat, and
you are wearing a Panama hat,
and so
listening to radio.
I fit in this category.
You're a very old young person. So, we're trying to figure out how we can combine these things in a neat way. But fundamentally, it's a problem of many parts of the application sort of performing the same job for the user, if that makes sense.
Is that not a product mistake?
I think it's a product mistake to make, because it's very easy to add features, and everyone is going to ask for many features. It is incredibly hard to remove features. And, this is like scientifically proven by, I think, Daniel Kahneman and Adam Tversky, where they gave, Harvard students a cup. First, they asked what they would pay for the cup. Then to the other half of the class, they gave the cup and asked what they would sell it for. And it turns out people value something they owned 1.5 times as much as they value never having had it. And that I think is a good product lesson. Like, it's going to be 1.5 times more painful to remove something than it was valuable to give it in the first place. So we're very careful with that. And that's the reason why we have many of those features in the app that kind of duplicate the same use case. And we're always trying to streamline it and simplify it, because there is this invisible cost of the application becoming more and more complex. As you said, it's really hard to find that feature. That's because even though it works really well for some people, that's because it competes with the other features. And if we put that on front, we would get another cost somewhere else. So this is the trick of serving enough use cases, but not overcomplicating the experience.
So we're going to move on to competition after this final question, I promise. The hard thing with, products like Spotify, like Twitter, where users love it and it is such a part of their daily life, is you have very visceral feedback and opinions. As you said there, people request a lot. How do you determine between the customer data that you listen to and engage with ingested into product roadmaps versus those where you say, I get it, Harry's moaning from London about not, go to radio being a couple of layers deep, but it's not a priority. How do you determine between the two? There
are a couple of common tricks. One is you separate new users from existing users. You're going to get very different metrics. Existing users who have a habit, your metrics may go down for a feature. And then if you try it on new users who never had that habit, you may see that if you're not taught the old paradigm, this is actually better. It's just that you train your user base on another paradigm. So that's one trick to figure out sort of some what the truth is, if it's actually better in some global sense. And then you can make the choice. Should we take the pain of retraining the existing audience? Because we know that if you just change the behavior, you will be more happy. Because if you never knew this old behavior, we can see that. That's one trick. The other way is to, back to radio, to try to figure out what it is you want to achieve. Do you really want a radio, or are you looking for a session that you can tune more easily, that can go cross-genre? What is it that you really want to do? And see if you can present that in a way that doesn't complicate the application, but just adding more features.
I totally get you, and I find that fascinating between new and existing users. I do want to touch on competition. We spoke about kind of product decision making there. Sometimes, in many cases, often for startups, competition's roadmap drives a lot of their roadmap. You've said before in your show, which is look at the competition and then do something completely different. Always love a contrarian opinion, so this is great. But why do you believe this? And can you explain it to me a little bit on why it's better to do something completely different?
So I think this is especially important for a smaller company going up against a bigger company. If you assume that the people in the bigger company are smart and competent people, which I think you should assume, then what they're doing, their strategy, probably makes a lot of sense to them. They're doing it because it plays to their strengths. Maybe they're leveraging their distribution, their hardware, their user base, their payments method, something like that, right? And so if you think about it, should you as a smaller player go up and try to do their strategy with less people, less budget, and less assets, you're just going to become a lesser version. I mean, that's a likely outcome. So especially as a smaller player, I think you should do the opposite. Try to figure out if there is a position where that bigger player isn't playing right now, and ideally doesn't even want to play because it's contrary to their business models. There's some sort of collateral damage, or what in strategy terms is called a counter position. There are exceptions to this. If you're a bigger player, there is it's a credible strategy to say, we see some new behavior, feature, user interface really working. Let's implement it and give it to our user base before they find it in this other user base. And you've seen this play out in the world. That's a reasonable strategy if you're a much, much bigger player. But Spotify has always been and still is a much smaller player than our competitors. So we tend to try to think about contrarian strategies.
Can you walk me through an example where you decided to do something completely different as Spotify to your competitors, where it worked or didn't work, but where you chose to do something completely different with this mindset?
So back to mobile, I described earlier when this macro wind of smartphones started really blowing hard, and we needed to figure out a free tier for the mobile phone. It was paid only at the time. If you looked around then and you said, who are our biggest competitors on mobile free music listening? It was and still is YouTube. And so what was the YouTube experience? Music was and is one of the biggest use cases for YouTube. And they have a fantastic experience. That experience is foreground, on-demand, playing with video, right? That's what you can do on YouTube. So it is amazing for discovering new music. You can see the artists that you're listening to. You can play things on demand and so forth. But then when you put the phone in your pocket, the free application doesn't background. So it stops playing. So we looked at this, and one strategy would be, that is what the market wants. That's the biggest player. We should go and get those same foreground on-demand video licenses that YouTube has. But the contrarian approach, which we chose in this case, was to say, what if we did the complete opposite? So what if we licensed a functionality that would work exactly where YouTube stops working? So we actually did the opposite. We licensed a background shuffle tier where you can play any playlist you want in shuffle mode in the background forever, but you actually can't play on demand in the foreground. So it turns out that Spotify mobile works exactly where YouTube mobile doesn't work, and vice versa. So we kind of said, okay, let them keep the foreground discovery that they're really good at, as long as we get all the background listening. And for us, that's been very effective because it turns out that most of the listening is actually in the background. So that was an example of trying to be as contrarian as possible.
Can I ask you a bold question? How does that thinking change when Spotify now has video? You know, I listen to all of my podcasts on Spotify. I love it as a podcast player now, but actually there's now video. And like, often I'm listening to it like walking, and I'm kind of looking at it, and I'm in London and I'm kind of about to get run over, and you know that would worry Shaq. Mother less so, but Shaq more so. You know, how does that change your product paradigm thinking when suddenly you do actually have to worry about like user engagement and video, not just background play?
So back to the contrarian sort of view, Spotify is, you know, the vast majority background application. And so that's what we optimize our music licenses for. First of all, in podcasts, we don't have to license. So we are allowed to play video on demand in the foreground as well. Mm-hmm. But if you look at what use cases we're going after, because we're mostly a background application, the use cases we're going after are these long, mostly backgrounded sessions, right? Podcasts typically. We're not going after the foreground sort of silent jujutsu videos that make no sense when you background them because it's just a lot of panting, right? We're going after the traditional podcasts. And so what we did, starting actually with the Joe Rogan podcast, was we built video into Spotify. We didn't know what the usage would look like. Maybe it would be that no one actually ever brought up and watched the video. But without saying exact metrics, what happened was exactly what you said. People consume the vast majority of these shows the majority of these shows in the background, but they do bring it up every now and then to see what they are talking about, who is talking. So we are using video mostly for the sort of talking heads format, if that makes sense. There are these famous moments of, you know, Elon Musk smoking weed, for example, on Joe Rogan podcast. So it turned out to fit very well with us.
You disappointed me. I thought we could do the same. You've got some nice, you know, garden plants in the background.
I'm in Sweden, Harry. It doesn't work that way.
I'm in London. It doesn't work that way either.
I know.
But no, I get you totally. I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask that? Is there a time when actually you sat around the table and you went, oh, shit, we should have copied them? It could be YouTube. It could be any of the other competitors where actually doing the different didn't work out.
Well, I would say this. There are certainly tons of things. It should have been faster. I think lyrics is an example of that, which we now have. Is very engaging. That was obvious. So we've certainly been super slow for various reasons on these things. In that case, it wasn't really because we had a contrarian view. It was actually, which is often the case, because of how the music industry works. So if you work normally at Twitter or Google or Facebook or something, you're as a product person, what you do is you try to figure out what the best possible thing is that you could build, and then you try to build that. What you do when you work in the music industry is you try to figure out what the best possible thing is. Then you go to the labels and you try to license the lowest common denominator of what is licensable. And that often means that you can't build the best possible product. You have to build with much, much narrower constraints. And often actually the cost is a constraint, because the job of a music label is to take a piece of IP and try to sell it to you as many times as possible. You know, foreground rights, background rights, video rights, sync rights, all of these rights. So you can see that as very annoying as a product person, or you can do what I do and see it as constraints are what makes the world interesting. You know, can you do something really good even within these narrow constraints? So that's actually been the biggest problem. And I would say for that reason, also, if you think about it, there hasn't been that much innovation in music listening. Yeah. It is search, playlisting, and so forth. I mean, we're working really hard, but it's not like other mediums where, you know, things change completely. I think the biggest innovation clearly in the last 6-7 years has been TikTok, who found like a new format of using music for something completely different.
How do you think TikTok did that? Sorry, help me understand that. We're surprisingly, I'm showing my age here, a bit so down with the goods. We're very big on TikTok, but in venture capital startup TikTok, like how did TikTok kind of reinvent a new medium format of music?
So it started in 2014 as Musical.ly, And there was a lot of trial and error. I've spoken to both the founders, and there was a lot of trial and error. And they sort of happened on this use case, and they didn't start by going and licensing stuff. There is a beauty in being small, small enough that people don't care. And that's actually a problem with being big. We can't really just try things. We have to license them first, which means we take the cost up front. So back then they were small enough to try this, and they tried to do something different actually, but they found product market fit. They kind of saw in the data what people were actually doing with these clips was recording dance videos, and they leaned into that. And then later they started licensing, and then they got acquired by ByteDance and got more distribution and so forth.
I totally get you. Final thing on your shows I want to touch on before we dive into basically a free-for-all from Daniel, Shaq, Alex Nordstrom, who finally actually responds. Takes days for this man.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Is a crucial one, but it's better to be lower on a taller mountain than higher on a smaller mountain. Sounds wonderfully poetic. What did you mean by this, and why is that?
So, what I mean is basically that when you worked with something for a very long time, whether it's a certain type of machine learning algorithm or maybe a certain user interface or a business model, by definition, it's going to be very well optimized, right? Because you spent so much time on it, it's going to be very efficient. But that also means that there isn't that much potential left in it because you've optimized it. You're close to the summit of that mountain. And so that's a problem. And most companies get there. If they're good, they get there. So when you're at that peak, the problem is to get somewhere, you have to sort of change something fundamental, which in this analogy is you have to jump to a different mountain. And that may sound, a mountain that has a higher summit, has more potential. The problem with that is when you jump from the peak of that first mountain, you're actually very likely to land somewhere at the base of the new mountain. So you're actually going to lose altitude, which means in product terms, your core metrics may go down. And in many cases, you might end up spending millions of dollars in a year just to get to where you were in the old paradigm. And as you can imagine, this is tricky in a public company with Wall Street pressure and, many employees and boards and so forth. I've literally had this problem where, or this challenge speaking to C-levels and boards where you explain that we spent millions of dollars in a year to get to exactly where we were 12 months ago. And people ask, so exactly why is that a success, right? But then 12 months later, you may have lowered your churn by 30% or something, but because you've iterated for another month. So this notion of having enough patience to, first having the guts to move from one mountain to another, and then having the patience to iterate your way back up to even control is very tricky. But it happens inevitably, and you can't avoid it because you're going to die if you don't.
Can I ask, was this the case with the introduction of podcasts? Obviously, we made the shift purely away from just music to obviously, podcasts and then also kind of video podcasts as well. Was that the case where actually it took a year to invest to reach feature parity with podcast players? I'm intrigued on that one.
For sure. Actually, podcast was mostly additional, so we didn't go down in metrics. Those cases have been when we changed user interface, for example, completely, or you changed a different recommendation algorithm, or you change something fundamental, your metrics may go down. Podcast was different because it was mostly additional, but it is true that it took a long time before Spotify was sort of, our internal goal was, get the podcast catalog on the service and build a best-in-class podcast player, feature parity. That was the first stage. And then obviously the idea was to pull away. But to your point, that took over a year before we had everything in place that people even expected from a podcast player. It was painful to spend that time, but it wasn't the problem of actually, losing altitude in the meantime.
Yeah, I totally get you on that one. I was intrigued. Sorry, before we do, you as a leader, where did you lose altitude? If you think back, where was it like, oh God, we're back at the bottom of this mountain. Fuck.
So a typical example was actually let's take the same example that we discussed because there's context around it. When we finally launched this mobile free tier that was contrarian to YouTube and that risked our business model, what happened was leading up to that, because fewer and fewer people used the desktop free tier, actually, from the outside, what happened was our conversion metrics looked better and better. It looked like a larger and larger percentage were becoming premium. But that's not because more were converting. That's because the free user intake was going down, right? So from the industry point of view, the conversion was at an all-time high. And what do you think happened when we launched this massive, massive free tier? It just dropped. Everyone downloaded the free app. No one converted for months, right? So the MAU metrics, the growth was very inspiring. That was an exponential curve, but premium conversion was an exponential curve in the other direction. And as you can imagine, many people, labels and investors, were wondering if that was going to catch up, or if we were down to like single percentage point premium conversion instead of like 30, 40%. It did catch up. First, we also needed to invest in ads monetization. So basically, the analogy here is user metrics went up, but monetization, both free ad monetization and paid conversion, that dropped severely in altitude.
Can I ask, are you shitting yourself in this moment? You have your board like putting pressure on you. You see single digits conversion. Your investors are putting pressure on you. Are you nervous as a product leader?
I think you should always be somewhat nervous and paranoid. And yes, I would say this, maybe not. I had a lot of faith that conversion would go up because we had seen so many years that the core correlation was the more you use the free product, the more likely you are to convert to paid. We call it the more you play, the more you pay, which always made sense to me. Like, you're going to start paying for a product you use and love. Yeah. You're not going to pay for something you don't use, right? So getting it to use it more means you're going to not want the ads. You're going to want offline. You're going to want to speak. So I was pretty certain of that. That wasn't my worry. The worry when we launched this free tier was if it was actually good enough. This contrarian hypothesis that we had, it could have been BS. It turned out to be true, but that we couldn't test at scale, really. So I was very nervous about that. I think investors and labels were much more nervous about the conversion metrics and the ads metrics. And also, to be quite honest, I wasn't responsible for the conversion of the ad metrics. So maybe other people were very nervous about it. But they did a great job and they caught up.
It's wonderful when you don't have responsibility for certain things in the pressure zone. It's funny, speaking of kind of other people within the org, I spoke to Daniel before the show, and the number one thing that he said that I had to ask you was, he said, ask him about talk is cheap. And so I want to dive into this. What is talk is cheap? What do you mean by this? And how does that come out in how you communicate, lead, are?
So it's sort of play on words. I believe deeply in this notion of Socratic debate. And I love debating with smart people. And I fundamentally believe that if we pay these high salaries that we pay in the tech industry for what are supposedly the best brains in the world, we should really maximize the value of that sort of rented brain power, right? And yet I find that specifically most US companies, they're quite hierarchical, and very smart people often don't really understand what they're doing or why. And they're underutilized. And if you think about it, that means they're actually overpaid for what they're doing, not because they're not smart enough, but because they're not leveraged enough. So in the tech world, there's always been, for a long time, there's been this notion of talk is cheap and that code decides arguments. So what I decided in order to sort of poke fun at that is to say talk is cheap, so we should do much more of it. Because in fact, just talking and debating with really smart people who are not afraid of you, importantly, which I think is also sort of a Swedish societal trait, that you're not so afraid of authority, is way cheaper than writing code. Writing code is one of the most expensive things you can do. So this thing of code decides argument, I never really bought. That you should only do when you're quite sure. Writing and shipping code to millions of people and waiting weeks for A/B test is not cheap. And my favorite example of this is, the Greeks, and I guess it was Democritus, who basically reasoned his way into the atom in 5th century BC. That shows how far you can get with just reasoning and debate. So it's very powerful. I think if you do it right in structured ways with the right people, sometimes you can sort of reason your way all the way to the end of something and literally save years by not doing something. And so that's what I mean with talk is cheap. I try to, instead of having only one-on-ones in my teams, I tend to have a lot of quite long meetings with the entire team, where we debate something. Even if it's like, one person, quote unquote, owns it, I think the input and the pushback from the rest of the team makes that person and that idea much better. And this is not new. This is what NASA has done forever. But for some reason, it's not that practiced, I feel. People talk more about the opposite, separate swim lanes rather than how to work together.
So I'm gonna dive in here and put my size 10s in, and you're gonna tell me I'm a moron. I think talk is very expensive, especially in early stage companies. It's about speed of execution. It's about getting shit done. And I'm invested in a couple of companies where we want to talk, we want to debate. Yes, let's theorize on the future of privacy. Fuck no, just ship. Learn, iterate, go. This is your only advantage. Why am I wrong?
Well, I think the way to think about it is there's a difference between being fast and being right. You can go very fast to nowhere. You can ship code every day. But if you're fundamentally wrong, you're just going to get to nowhere extremely efficiently and fast. And so I've found, especially if you're doing a more complex thing, and maybe this is actually because I come from the music industry, where building product had to be licensed as the lowest common denominator between, 3-4 majors, with, the impact of being wrong being 3-4 years, because that's a term of one of these licenses. So I maybe we've been trained as a company to be more careful because the cost of being wrong was incredibly high. Yeah. But I actually think that cost of being wrong forced us to model the world slightly better and longer. Maybe because we were afraid of mistakes, but I actually think that grew into a skill at Spotify. Now, of course, you can debate endlessly. You need ownership. You need to make decisions. And Spotify has certainly been guilty of being too unclear in who owns something, and it can slow the organization down. But fundamentally, I think now we have a really good balance where quite a lot of people actually have a fundamental strategic view of what we're doing and why. And this debate builds a lot of alignment that actually makes you faster, especially if you need to do something that's bigger than your own team.
So, okay, I get you. I'm a startup founder listening. How do I set up these debates for success? Do you, head of product and all-round OG in life, say, Harry, this is the topic, lead the discussion for an hour? Is there multiple discussion topics? How do you like to structure them to get the best outcomes?
So I think if I were a startup founder again, first of all, I would obviously try to hire people that are very smart. So I would debate a lot with my team, and that's what I've done in the 2 startups that I've founded, and that has been very fruitful. We managed to discuss our way to insights that were actually quite novel. I think that saved us a lot of time and managed to create good outcomes just through talking through, what if with smart people. The other trick, if you're a smaller company, is you use other people. You call Harry and you say, I want to debate with you. What do you think of this? And I think, you can time box it. I actually have pretty long discussions, like 1 or 2 hours for a topic to really empty it out. My personal experience is, 1 to 2 hours may save you months of building the wrong thing. So I think it's worth it.
My final one on this is, I do like it in many ways, especially for larger companies. Often more junior people or even middle tier people will not feel the security to express their true opinions against Gustav. You say something and you say it with energy and charisma and conviction. It takes quite a lot if you're new or junior to say, Gustav, I totally disagree with you. How do you think about creating environments of safety where more junior people can have debate and disagreement in a productive way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I saw that shift pretty clearly when we started hiring more in the US. US people were just used to hierarchy. Yeah. And I could find people, there were a lot of misunderstandings between Swedish people and Americans in many ways. Swedish people are better at some things, but they're much worse at other things. Swedes do this form of silent disagreement that Americans interpret as actual agreement, but it's not. You're just silent and you disagree. So lots of cultural challenges there. But I think the way to do it is to model the behavior. I think back to, what I liked about Daniel is he models that behavior. So in his team, you can debate quite fiercely. You can tell the CEO in a pretty heated voice that you disagree and you don't like that and you're not going to get fired. I think it starts there. And then I try to do the same thing, having, sometimes heated debates with my direct reports, often in front of their direct reports. And sometimes it's a little bit shocking maybe for them. They figure like, oh, now my boss is going to get fired. And then he or she isn't, and it's fine. And then they learn that, okay, it's apparently okay to disagree. That doesn't mean, to your point of efficiency, that you don't need to make decisions. Like everyone else, you need to sometimes disagree and commit. But I think it's important. I try to call people out in a positive way in the meeting and say, like, what do you think about this? And obviously, the first time someone might be nervous. But if the rest of the people in the room said what they actually think, other people tend to as well.
Final one on this, I promise. Does Zoom and COVID change the way that you do these sessions and these debates? And do you feel that there is a change in the quality of the debates in a virtual versus a in-person world?
It's interesting because I think I've been trying to figure this out. I actually think some of them have gotten better because the notion of seeing everyone on screen and having to sort of mute, it's given a bit more structure because you have the obvious problem that some people would dominate a discussion when it's live. And I have actually seen less of that problem over Zoom. The other thing I've done, which is interesting during COVID, is I've simply put my AirPods in and then had remote walk and talks with individuals or with groups of people where you walk for a few hours and sort of group talk. That's actually been very, very fruitful. So I thought when COVID happened that what would really suffer was strategy discussions and that kind of ideation. But for some reason, it hasn't. So I would say one of the things I also tell my teams that I think is quite different from what many other companies do is I find that a lot of executives, they look at their org and they try to split it as much as possible. They try to divide and conquer and desynchronize and find swim lanes and divide problems. They try to sort of cut up the org in as many independent units as possible for the purposes of sort of parallelization. And that makes sense from a point of view. But we've actually chosen, back to sort of trying to be contrarian, I've chosen to do the complete opposite in my organization because even if I have a really big organization with thousands of people, at the end of the day, it's just one user who is going to use this application. They're not going to care if it was, Eva or Sten or Magnus or whoever built this. They don't care about who the library team is or who the search team is. It's just one user. And the experience needs to feel as if it was built by a single developer for a single user. So when people come and talk to me about swim lanes and, how they want more independence and so forth, I tend to tell them that they're doing the wrong sport. We're not doing competitive swimming. We're doing synchronized swimming. It's much harder, but it's also much more beautiful to watch when you look at it. And that's what we want the product to look like. And that means that it's quite different to work at Spotify than many other companies. You're going to have more debate because I'm always trying to synchronize my leadership team instead of trying to divide them and find clear divisions where they can run fast. Basically, what I believe in is this old maxim of, you want to go fast, you go alone. You want to go far, you go together. And certainly Spotify wants to go far. So we overemphasize on that.
In terms of synchronizing leadership, I'm too interested. What have you done that has worked and what has not worked that you've disregarded? So I think if we start with what has not worked, the mistake you can do in this, not having swim lanes, is it's very unclear who's responsible for anything. Everyone is responsible for everything, and no one makes decisions because they're often in Spotify because they're too nice. That's actually a bigger problem than people being too aggressive. In other companies, you may have the opposite, that if it's unclear, people are going to power grab. I've seen the opposite. It's like people don't want to step on other people's toes, so they don't make decisions. So that's a problem with this model. So you still need to make it clear where the ultimate decision or responsibility and accountability lies. And that's a balance. If you go too far, you're going to create a swim lane and this person is going to run away and do something
and think that everyone else in the company is a moron, and everyone else is going to think everyone else is a moron. So the tricky thing with this is finding the balance of accountability and ownership, so you feel agency, but still having a single strategy and having alignment. So I'm saying that even if you own something, let's say you own what end user experience looks like, you actually have to take your strategy, bring it up in this forum, debate it and defend it. It may be that other people disagree and they have to disagree and commit, but your responsibility is to be able to explain your strategies and answer these questions. And if you're there and you can't answer any of these questions, you're probably going to adapt. If you're there and you can answer all these questions, then it's fine. So it's sort of self-regulating. But what I'm doing is I'm forcing people to sort of bring up their ideas and have them not critiqued, because it's a very positive forum, but have them debated.
Can I ask, leadership, we mentioned like hierarchies there. Often with scaling companies, bluntly, leadership changes are very normal and they happen, and they have happened at Spotify, as they do in every company. You and Alex, I believe, are the only ones who survived multiple layers of leadership transitions, obviously with Daniel. My question to you is, and a question from Shaq, is, bluntly, how did you have to reinvent yourself with each stage, and what moments did you have to develop the most?
So it sounds like it's an episode of Hunger Games, and we're the only ones who survived.
You're cut. There's the only ones left. You're gone. Cake or death? Cake, please.
So I think there are two pretty distinct moments that come to mind. One is in the early days, coming into Spotify and having done my own startups. Those startups were small. When I sold them, they were 20 people or something like that. So I had a very distinct leadership style, which I sort of learned in the army, which is leading by example. Very simple, but very effective. If you want people to do something, you just have to do it yourself first, right? So if you want your team to work weekends to hit a release, you just bring your sleeping bag and you sleep on the floor next to your team. And if you can't code, then you go and buy pizza for the team or something. It's incredibly effective. And so for small teams, I still recommend that. And I think people underestimate it. But I came to this point at Spotify where it didn't scale. You can't sleep in that many different rooms at the same time. And I just had to change. And that was quite painful. So I had to change from this sort of leading by example. It was painful in two ways. I ran out of time, too many teams. And also, you can't really be that deep on everything. So I had to change my leadership style and instead start to coach other leaders to lead teams. And that was a painful moment for me to figure that out, because I didn't really have any coaching or anything like that. I just had to sort of reason with myself, what is it that's happening? Why am I constantly running out of time? And when you do something that works, you're likely to just keep doing it and keep doing it. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was when deep learning really happened. This was, around 2014, 2015, something like that, when it started happening. And I had been out of university for quite a long time. So I didn't really code anymore. And I wasn't that familiar. I'd read a little bit about this at university, but I didn't know it deeply. And I felt that, I wasn't deep enough in this to credibly lead this change, because it was very clear to me that it was a fundamental change. So I basically had to go back to school and start from the basics, reading the math, coding, doing all the examples, bottoms up, and implementing all the code, and then teach myself. And this took a long time, until I could start reading scientific papers and sort of educate myself on this. That was hard because it costed so much time for me and for my family. But I think it was incredibly important, and it certainly paid off for me and hopefully for the company. But that was tough, because this was a tough time for Spotify as well, to sort of find all that time to re-educate yourself on something rather complex. So I think those were the two toughest moments. And they happen every now and then. You know, when something like crypto comes along, if you're going to be a technology leader, you need to understand it deeply. Otherwise, you can't evaluate what you should do. So that was another moment of, okay, it's back to school again. You have to start coding. You have to read. You have to start reading papers. It's hard to keep up with. It's easy to slip into like, I'm just a manager now.
2 questions. Totally agree it is hard. You could have hired in. You could recruit a head of ML. You could bring those skills in-house and remain in the same position that you are. Why did you decide to integrate vertically yourself versus add on with an existing talent?
I mean, I'm an engineer at heart. I hate working for people who don't know what I'm talking about. So I imagine that people would think the same of me. If you talk to your boss and you're like, this guy or this girl doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about, you know, I have a hard time respecting them. So that's how I feel. I feel like an imposter if I don't understand what I'm supposed to be responsible for.
Second thing, whether it's sleeping in the office with your team, whether it's the late nights running to get the pizza, whether it's the going back to school to learn ML, your family respectfully are the ones at home without you. How do you communicate the value of what you're doing to them where they see the importance of why dad's not there?
I ask them to listen to the podcasts. No, it is a great question. So this is something that I think I've heard many people talk about this. I've certainly felt it myself. You're so engulfed by your work and you get a lot of positive feedback from work, at least as long as the company is going well. But then at home, and you try your best to be a good leader and inspiring and so forth. And then at home, you're actually not inspiring at all. You kind of suck. And so, my wife, who she is the one who said this, like, I need to come and see you at work every now and then, so I understand what it is you're actually good at. Because at home, I don't see it. Like, and I think she has a really good point there. And like, you need to be impressed by each other, right? And remember that, because when you see yourself day to day, you mostly see the not so impressive sides of each other. So we try to do that. I try to make sure I see her doing the stuff that she's really good at. And she's made sure that she sees and cares about some of the stuff I do. And then you find this like, love and respect for each other, and you refine it. That's the best way I've found. I try to do the same with my kids every now and then, bring them along and see what I do. And that helps. But there's no cure for like, you want to spend time with your family. And I am quite religious about that.
I mean, Esther Perel, who obviously spoke at Brilliant Minds, and I'm sure you know well, but she says you're most attracted to your partner when they are in their element. When your wife sees you leading a product review, she's like, "Woof, Gustav, baby." I'm sure, and likewise, vice versa. So. Final one on actually just you, and then we're going to do a near-death experience, and then wrap up with a quick fire. Do you have any other? I've seen you and your wife, and it's this beautiful marriage and relationship. Do you have any like genuine relationship advice to me on what it takes to have such a strong and loving marriage and relationship?
Tricky question. I mean, I actually met my wife when I was 20, 21. She was 19. And we didn't marry for, many years. So we had a very long sort of trial period. It's like a freemium model, right? So when we married, we were pretty sure. So I don't know what good advice might be there. We were together for a long time before we married. I was working quite hard. I was traveling the world before I started working very hard. She studied and traveled. We lived in different places. So we had a lot of freedom and had known each other for quite a long time before we actually started living together. So I think that was important. Neither one of us felt the need to I need to go explore and feel like I'm missing out. We had done many of those things, even though we met earlier. I would also say that, my wife and I were certainly different in many ways, but we are very similar in values. Yeah. That helps quite a lot. We almost never have disagreement on sort of values, what we think about things. then we are very different in terms of our skills, completely different. And I think that's a benefit. You know, she's fantastic at the things I'm really bad at. So we complement each other really, really well.
And we all share a common dislike of like loud music and parties. I remember congregating with you in a corner. But no, I totally get you in that, and I appreciate that. Final one on just the leadership, I do have to ask you, you come across as so self-assured, confident, with conviction. When you review your leadership today, Gustav, is there any elements where you're like, I could be better here? That is a weakness of my leadership.
Of course. I think everyone has imposter syndrome. And certainly when you when you're fortunate enough to work in a company that grows this much, even if you have the same title, I've been sort of CPO, CTO for several years, it changes every year because first you're a CPO of a tiny Swedish company, then you're CPO of a Scandinavian company, then of a global company, and then of a, listed New York company. The job changes all the time. And every time you feel like there's no way I can be that person. You're an imposter all the way, I think. So I certainly feel like that. And I think I've grown to understand my weak spots better with age. I already told you one, which is I sort of have this global CEO perspective, which is helpful. I think is one of the reasons why Daniel likes having me around, because he feels like I care about the outcome of the company. But it is also tricky when you get in other people's shit. That's always tricky, and I have to balance, how I do that in a diplomatic way. So I have all kinds of flaws.
I would also say elegance of communication. It's tricky when you get in other people's shit. Gustav, wonderfully put. I mean, so beautifully elegant. The final element that I do have to touch on before a quick fire, I spoke to Mignano before the show, and he said there are many near-death experiences that are kind of wonderfully entertaining / educating to hear. If you were to choose your kind of favorite near-death experience to tell, what comes to mind for you?
Well, like Mike said, there are actually a few. I've seen Spotify have negative growth, actually losing users and contracting at least twice. And I speak to people in the industry. It's very rare. People have seen that, but the company never survived to talk about it. Right? It's very rare to actually see it and survive and do it twice. But I think the favorite near-death experience story that I don't think is widely known is quite early on when, we have a really, we talk about the labels and negotiation with the labels as sort of being frustrating, but it's not in a sense, because it is their job to represent these artists and try to maximize the value of their IP, right? And I actually think they're doing a good job of it. It can be frustrating as a product person, but we've developed this really good relationship with the music industry and these labels. But early on, it was different. I don't know that they actually believed that Spotify would work. Maybe they felt that, you could get access to cheap VC money here, expecting us to sort of, belly flop over. And so it was more a tenuous relationship. And they certainly didn't understand the model, right? And so they were very, very scared of the free tier, the desktop free tier. And their notion was that if you just make the free experience worse, more people are going to convert. And I was of the opposite notion, as I said. I think the more you play, the more you're going to pay. That's what the data showed. But one of the labels sort of put a gun to our head and said, you can't have a free tier anymore. In that case, we're going to pull our catalog from free and premium. And so for us, we decided that was existential. And we decided to fight it. So we built this thing called the switch, a switch that you could pull that would basically remove quarter or a third of the music catalog. It would break everyone's playlists. It would basically be a horrible experience for both free and premium users, while our competitors would have full catalog, so probably catastrophic. But we decided to fight it and say, this is important enough that we have to take that risk. So we built this. And I remember sort of being responsible for the one who should pull this switch. And we had a team I think they were maybe I don't know if they were in the UK or the US negotiating the licenses. And somewhere, we were supposed to pull the switch at midnight. Oh, that was serious. So we were supposed to pull the switch at midnight and basically take off this catalog, and millions of users would get this message like your music is gone. And somewhere around 11:30 at night, we were sort of starting to say our goodbyes to each other. And then
Titanic.
Yeah.
Lifeboat's coming.
And that was a pretty scary moment. And then the call came in not long before midnight that they had backed down and we could keep this catalog. And so for me, that was sort of our Cuba crisis. I think we were very close to total annihilation in that moment.
God, that is pretty terrifying. Why did you decide to fight?
Because I don't think we had a choice. We believed in the strategy we had. We believed that this was the model. At least for us, freemium was the only model. We had seen other players, I think it was like Nokia Comes With Music and stuff, who tried to go straight to premium. And it didn't work. People didn't think they wanted to pay for music at the time. You needed a free tier. So for us, we had to make sure that this was a credible threat, that we were actually prepared to go down. And we were. We would have. I don't know what would have happened, but we were.
Final one before the quickfire. You mentioned the constraints that labels bring and that licensing brings. If labels and licensing were entirely Spotify's, entirely integrated, just in a hypothetical world, what would you do from a product perspective with the removal of constraints? What would you do in an ideal world?
So I think what I would do is I would try to make the music experience much more interactive. I think this is what you see with TikTok as well. I think users want to participate in the music. They want to use the music. Today they can use it to make dance videos. But I think, there's so many talented musicians out there who sit at home and play their piano or their guitar and they sing and they create music. But the licensing world means that, they can't use a beat from the song that they love. If you think about coding as an analogy, when you want to learn to code, what you do is you go to GitHub and then you have this vast library of open source code that you can use and that you can look at and you can start prototyping from and building and learning. There isn't anything like that in music. There is no GitHub for music. That's probably what I would change. I would try to, and I think that's the reason why music has actually had very little innovation. The track is sort of still 3 minutes and, an intro and 2 choruses 100 years later almost. So that's probably what I would try to do, just innovate on the formats. That's not true. Other media formats have changed drastically over the years, but music hasn't so much.
Final one, I promise. I read somewhere about Olivia Rodrigo and how she has changed the structure of her actual songs to accommodate the changing algorithms of music, whereby choruses are much more brought forward. Is that true? And is this a new music creation process to fit technology?
I think that's absolutely true. We've seen small versions of that as well. So when you move from the download world to the streaming world, there is no, in a financial sense, no marginal cost to try another track, right? Which means you're going to start exploring more, which we think is great. So it gives more artists an opportunity. You're also going to start to listen to a lot of new music, like sleep music and focus music. Whereas if you paid, $1 per 3 minutes, you probably wouldn't soundtrack your sleep. So So entire industries popped up because the business model changed and they adapted the music. But you also see it because people now have shorter attention spans. You can see the chorus moving closer and closer to the beginning of the song, right? Everyone is trying to optimize for the first few seconds. And I don't know if I think that's good or bad, but it is what it is. Like incentives and systems drives behavior for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We see it on TikTok. TikTok, it's all about grabbing the attention in the first second and a half, which is absolutely knackering when you get to my age, Gustav, and you have to be in front of the camera. But
that's why you have a hat.
It's why I have a hat, But I want to dive into a quick fire. I could talk to you all day. So I say a short statement. You give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
That sounds good.
This one was actually from Daniel, which is, what is the future of podcast and audio? And he added, will future Harry have a job? Which was an unnerving addition.
So I can't say exactly what it is. That's a secret. But what I can say is that I think it is at least as large as social networking, 2-3 billion plus. The way I think about it is, I think music and actually podcasting is a sort of a core human behavior, like communication. And that means that the sort of TAM in finance or product speak, total addressable market, should be the same. So that's the reason that I keep working here. I think we're far from scale at this business.
Not on schedule, but I'm intrigued. Do you agree with Mike Mignano's suggestion of the disregard of the social graph and the movement into the media recommendation engine of the future?
For sure. I mean, Spotify went through this journey, and this is one of the macro wins that we saw quite early. And and Mike and I have discussed this at length. Spotify started as I wouldn't call it social media. I would call it curation media. It's a different version of the same thing, which means the internet started with you taking something offline, friends, books, music, and then asking users to curate it into graphs, playlist, friend graphs. That was the pattern, right? And that's where Spotify grew up. And then it shifted from curation to recommendation, where users weren't prepared to put in all of that work to soundtrack themselves. We actually had an in-between, which was editorial, where we had editors or professional playlisters that helped curate for you. But the natural extension of that is to start combining the editors with machine learning, right? And now we have many pure machine learning set. So we actually made a bet on the shift from curation to recommendation, or social media to recommendation media, 4 or 5 years ago, and rebuilt the application quite drastically. And today I would say we are a recommendations-based company much more than a curation-based company.
Completely unfair again, but joys of it being my show. Which competitor do you most respect, and why?
I have a great deal of respect for all of these sort of big tech companies, the usual suspects, the Google and YouTube, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and so forth. But what I think is interesting specifically and impressive about this set of companies that I think is different from the previous set of companies is that I think there's a reason we call them technology companies. And some people say that makes no sense. Like, car companies were also technology companies at the time. Everything was a technology company until it became old. But I do think these companies are a bit different, because I do think they think of technology itself as the strategy. What do I mean by that? I mean that people try to label them. They try to label Amazon as a book company, and then as a book and diapers company, and as an everything store. But then they started doing AWS, and people can't pin these companies down. Same with Google. They were a page on the internet, search page. Then they became the start page of a browser, and then they became the start page of a browser of an OS, and they did email, and then they did photos and so forth. Same with Apple, computer company, music company, phone company. These companies, they refuse to be categorized as what they are, and they keep changing all the time. And I think it's because they think of technology itself as a strategy. So technology is this gift that is going to present opportunities to you every 5 years. It's going to be a broadband, a smartphone, an AI, a crypto or something. And the job of this company is not to say no, we're a car company, we're going to do cars. They're saying that, no, we're a technology company. We're supposed to understand and master these technologies very quickly and then figure out how we can change our business model to leverage these things. And that's why they keep changing. And so I think there is some chance that these companies will be around longer, because they refuse to answer to the question, what are you? They just say I don't know, ask me tomorrow. They keep changing. And that's how I want to think about Spotify as well. It's one of the reasons we went from music to podcasts and now to audiobooks. And people sort of wanted to keep us in the, no, you're a music company, you shouldn't be doing this. And then it's no, okay, I guess you're an audio company, but you definitely shouldn't be doing video. And people want to sort of keep us back. But I don't think there is any stopping. I think you always need to ladder up. And so I think of us as a technology company in that sense. My job is to understand technology and how we need to reposition ourselves all the time to leverage this new technology. There's no reason why that we would be at the end of history right now in terms of technology.
It's one of the biggest lessons that Shaq taught me, which is like, people always want to put you in a box, number one. And two, you have to earn the right to do the next thing. But what's got you to where you are won't necessarily be what gets you to the next thing. And actually,
Exactly.
you have to change and adapt. And it's one of the biggest transformations that I've had, again, thanks to Shaq. Which product leader outside of Spotify do you most respect and admire?
So I thought about this a bit because I get that question asked quite a lot. I admire a ton of people for different things, but I would say, it's always because people answer mostly the same things. And so I also admire the same people that everyone else does. But to say something maybe unexpected, there is a product that I've specifically fallen in love with over the last year. I actually don't know the name of the product leader, but I've been trying to learn. I try to learn new stuff every now and then. And after machine learning, I took a break, and then now I'm trying to learn a few new things. And one of them is playing the piano. It feels like when you're working at a music company, you should probably be able to play the piano. So I've been using this application called Simply Piano, which you hook up to your piano over MIDI, and I really like it because it is so for two reasons. First, it's a really good application. What you want to do when you start to play piano is you don't want to start with these child songs. You want to start right away with the rock songs. And so what they've done is they've painstakingly, and I have a lot of empathy for this because I work in the music, they've painstakingly licensed like all the popular music. So you literally get your Taylor Swift or whatever it is that you want to play. And then they've staged it so that you start playing and you're actually only filling in a few notes here and there. But it sounds amazing. You think you're a full bleed piano rock star from day one. So you're having a lot of fun. And then it's like a competition. You get scores for hitting the right notes at the right time and so forth. So it's like a little game, and it takes like maybe 5 minutes to master a song. And then it gets progressively harder. And at the end, and I know because I am at the end, I got this sort of end of year note from them where it said I was the top 1% of their user base. As I've gone to the very end. At the end, you're actually playing the full songs, and with all the chords and accompaniments and so forth. So that's actually my favorite application right now.
I was just checking. I was looking it up. Actually, I was going to see who the kind of head of product is there. Sorry, I'm just completely off. The hard thing is, like, often for me as an investor, great products don't always lead to great investments. Like, fundamentally, a lot of products like that, listen, as great as the products are, unless you get the incentive frameworks right for usage, as well as I do, humans are lazy. Humans are not as disciplined as you are. You're the most disciplined person on the planet, Gustav. But point being, it doesn't lead to a great investment often. And that's the thing that I find so hard as someone who loves product as much as me, is you have to be more multifaceted. Does that make sense?
It does. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because that's you asked about like insights sort of through my career. Yeah. I've always been incredibly passionate about technology, even for the sake of technology and product. And I find so much joy in I wonder if we could build this thing, just see if we can build it. Yeah. And at the beginning of my career, that means you undervalue the importance of the business model. But what made it click for me, and I think this is true for many. So what I talk to my teams about now is, the greatest innovations are when you find a new technology and you change not just the product and how you use it, but you change the business model. Those are always the most disruptive changes. And, to some people who care, mostly about design or product, it may almost feel like, making money is something bad and something negative, and it's only VCs who care about money. The way I phrase it is, if you want to build the greatest product on earth, it's going to require a lot of engineers. And so if you have a 20% margin and your competitor has a 40% margin, you both make $1, they're going to hire twice the engineers. They're going to build twice as good a product. Like, you want to finance that product passion. So you need a good business model. I found that a useful way to get people more interested in how you can innovate on business models as well. So that's my big passion, is actually to try to combine consumer innovations with business model innovations. It's much harder, takes longer, But if you can do it, it is the most exciting thing and it tends to have the most impact.
Do you think there is a business model innovation, I cannot believe I'm saying this, with Web3 and crypto?
It's a tricky question. So I love crypto from that technology angle. You know, I'm a sucker like many people for this. This is like a true computer science innovation. And I'm very excited about the possibilities of trustless cooperation and so forth. But like everyone else in the very near term, maybe a bit disillusioned with the fact that while the promise is there for sort of trustless cooperation, actually one of the biggest problems seems to be how you trust other people on this network. And, you sort of go back to the Web 2 world to actually verify who someone is. So I think it's early. I am fundamentally excited about it from a technology point of view, but I don't yet have an opinion on if there is a big business model there. I have a feeling that just like AI and other things, it will take quite a long while, but it's going to be, there is a chance that it becomes a fundamental part of the infrastructure just further down, that it actually powers a lot of things and is very valuable, but it might not actually be on the consumer end. That might be one of the mistakes, that consumers don't care so much about cryptography. But if it can solve fundamental problems, like, on the TCP/IP level, it could be incredibly valuable.
Penultimate one for you. What would you most like to change about the world of product?
I think...
So like mine is like the rise of like operated product leaders. And what I mean by that is the operated product leaders bring in process, bureaucracy. The only word they ever say is alignment, and they do very little. But they bring this red tape and process, and they really irritate me.
I did spend a lot of time earlier in my career on frameworks and models to work efficiently. And, we had some internal frameworks and we used lots of external ones. So I spent a lot of time on that. I don't spend so much time on it anymore because the company is so big that the different product leaders within my org, they tend to have their own processes. I guess at a sort of higher level, what I would like to change is probably to try to demystify it a bit, as I'm trying to do through the podcast. People talk about whether product is science or art. And most people tend to answer that it's art. But I think that's mostly for self-preservation purposes. It's called the conspiracies against the laity, as Bernard Shaw said. You want to protect your own profession by making it seem really hard. I think that, there are lots of product people who have seen a lot of products, so they have good instincts and they can make the right decisions, but they can't explain it. And then it looks like art. But I think the really good product leaders, they can actually explain their thinking. And that's much more valuable because then you can share it. So I actually think product is 100% science and 0% art, which I know is going to upset some people. And so I feel like my mission then is to try to demystify it, for example, through the podcast and make it much more accessible.
Sorry, I'm being divided. If you think it's 100% science, then it is 100% replicable. And it is not 100% replicable. It is clear that, like Tony Fadell, Scott Belsky, the innovations and creativity that come from visionaries like them, and I would say from you, are absolutely in the same category. I'm defending you here. You are wrong. It is not, because we can't replicate Gustav 100 times over. That's why you are you. But
I think really great leaders, they are able to introspect themselves, synthesize how they think about something. It is hard to do, but it is possible. And then put that into a model or try to scale it. And if you can do that, it makes the entire company much better than you bottlenecking the entire company. And so I actually don't make a lot of the product decisions at Spotify. I have lots of opinions and I sit in these meetings, but I feel like I managed to build a team that is at least as good and often much better than myself at product instincts. And I think that's because we've spent so much time trying to understand and talk about how we think about the world, instead of just saying like, no, my neural network here has a lot of pattern recognition, so I'm going to say what's right. of course, great product leaders who have seen lots of product, they're going to make the right decisions because they have pattern recognition. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to try to figure out why you have that recognition. It's just much harder. And oftentimes you're like, I just know that this is right. Just trust me. I don't want to spend the time talking. But if you wanted to, if you were forced to, you could try to walk through the steps of understanding why. And I think those lessons are the most valuable part. So I want to argue that it is science. It doesn't mean that science is easy, but I still think it's science. Whether you happen to have very good instincts and then you've just internalized the science. It's still science.
Gustav, final one for you. Actually, penultimate one. What's your favorite memory of working with Shaq, the many years with Shaq? I have many, but I'm intrigued.
So what I think is special about Shaq and why he is such a core part of Spotify's history is that, as I said, Spotify is from one view a tech company. It kind of grew up in this era of leveraging new technology. And as I said, that's I think that is our core, trying to always understand new technology. But it is also right in between this world of, nerds and hardcore tech like myself and rock and roll. And that's always been really interesting at Spotify, when you're sitting and you're writing code and then, Kanye West comes and knocks on your shoulder. And, there are these surreal moments. And Shaq happens to be responsible for most of them. For some reason, he has this incredible ability of finding people, getting people to like. I haven't met a person that doesn't like Shaq. I'm sure they exist, but I haven't met them. And I think he is the embodiment for me of marrying the technology world with, Hollywood and the music world. And it's very hard to find that kind of person in a company like this, and to get that person to be able to work in a company like this. As you can imagine, Shaq is not a big friend of like product processes and reviews and stuff. But Daniel has managed to make this work and have Shaq run these special operations for Spotify throughout the years that have been incredibly impactful, around our US launch and all these artist relations. It's just a very hard person to describe, fascinating person.
I always say he sees in you what you don't often see in yourself, which is
That's very well put.
I've had time to practice it, Gustav. But listen, I've so enjoyed this. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me, and I cannot thank you enough for today.
Likewise. Always great speaking to you, and always love talking product.